today, before the release of the War Within beta, which will make many players able to test the new shiny things for the next expansion, we can draw some conclusions about the current state of all of these specs and classes and come with a question for today. What do players think is the worst thing of their class or of their spec? What do they think is something that should be improved or changed or removed about their class? It could be a complaint about certain specs or classes being too squishy, not having enough defensives, perhaps the opposite, being too tanky could be a problem, maybe having too much utility crammed in a single class or spec, or having the wrong damage profile, having too many buttons to press, or not having enough buttons to press. All of these could be valid complaints about certain specs or classes, things that never made you able to get into those specs, for example. So we are starting with the current theme of the season. I think it was fitting. We are starting with Demon Hunter. Now, surprisingly, I think not many players were going to have this opinion many years ago, but nowadays, Havoc Demon Hunter is doing pretty well. I think it's a pretty balanced and solid spec. Long were the days where many players complained that Blizzard clearly made this spec for children, pressing 2 buttons and looking all cool with style over substance, etc, etc. I think now it's looking much better. The problem is, of course, on the other side, which is Vengeance, and the current problem they have created in Mythic Plus, due to Blizzard's balancing of dangerous casts of mobs and the requirement of crowd control. Currently, Vengeance is just too strong at that, which is monopolizing the power level of tanks in Mythic Plus. That is what I would say is the current problem when it comes to Demon Hunters, that we might want to see at least changed or adjusted in the next expansion. After that, we have Death Knight. I believe Death Knight to be quite a decent class. One of the more stable specs in recent memory is Blood. Blood has historically been a very solid, very good tank. It's nice to play, it's entertaining, nice amount of buttons, nice amount of options for you to use, somewhat similar to Unholy. I also enjoy the way Blizzard is planning to change Unholy a little bit more from their super long GCD locked opener and massive bursts of cooldown, and trying to make them a more fleshed out and versatile spec. Perhaps the only one complaint is that Blizzard doesn't seem like to be having a good idea of what to do with Frost, sort of locked for a long time in their Breath of Sindragosa phase. It's been hard to get away from that style. That is perhaps the one thing I would be complaining about for Death Knight as a class. They're not particularly squishy or too tanky, they don't have that much utility, but they also have some good things that they can bring, so overall they are in a pretty healthy situation as a class. It might get a little bit more complicated when it comes to Druid as a class. They span every single playable role in the game: tank, healer, melee, and range DPS. Some players might get into the question about Druid having a bit too much utility, from having Typhoon as a knockback, but then also having Vortex as a ground chain CC. They have the option of a single target stun, the incapacitating roar for a fear. They have a single target interrupt, the AoE interrupt for balanced Druid. Pretty good off healing as well as of course a raid buff in Mark of the Wild, and even some help to the healers with Innervate. So they have tons of utility. I don't think any of these is, particularly excessive for the spec. I don't think balance right now, even after many reworks, is in too bad of a spot. Same goes for Resto Druid, even though some Resto players might be complaining about the focus given to their treants recently by Blizzard. Although with the introduction of the hero talents, they now have a few more options to move away from being so treant reliant. What might be the bigger issue nowadays is, of course, Feral Druid, which for a long time, actually, not just nowadays, has felt a little bit like a copy of an Assassination Rogue, and it's not that Assassination Rogue is doing too hot either. So it's a pretty bad state for Feral. What is also a problem is that they don't really bring anything unique. At least Enhancement Shaman gets away with bringing something unique. Unlike the rest of the Shamans with Wind Fury Totem, Feral doesn't even have that. So that perhaps might be the main issue of the class going forward in the War Within. The more focus on Feral Druid and how to make them more valuable to the player base. After them, alphabetically, we have Evoker. Well, it's a fresh new class, and I would say overall it's a success when you count devastation and preservation, where the problems start to get a little bit more, well, problematic is with augmentation. By many players, the main defining trait of augmentation, the main adjective they would give to augmentation is abomination. And that's more or less correct. This support experiment seems to be quite in a weird state. We have seen now in Mythic Plus they have again made up the ranks in power. They are again part of this meta comp, just like they were in the previous season. So it's kind of tough to imagine any valuable changes to sort of fix this issue. The defensive power they can bring to the group, which becomes super valuable at high key levels, as well as how well they can line up with what's important in Mythic Plus, which is burst cooldowns. Big major burst cooldowns thanks to their Breath of Eons. That seems to be a major issue for Evokers. They do have, like Druid, a lot of good utility. They don't have a proper raid buff, unlike the Druids. So overall, it's a pretty balanced situation, aside from the state of augmentation. Now, when it comes to Hunters, we are in a pretty weird situation, because many players would describe Hunter as a bit too simple, a bit too straightforward, a bit too generic, both for marksmanship and beast mastery. However, clearly, based by the massive amount of players who do play Hunter, at least the ranged version of Hunter, that's what much of the player base enjoys. So it might seem weird or a bit confusing, but they are plenty enjoyed by many players. If we had to come with a problem with Hunter, is number one, the fact that they don't really have a raid buff or anything major you want to bring them for. Yes, they could have a Bloodlust, even the newly added Hunter's Mark, but it's not a major thing. And the other problem for Hunter is, of course, their defensiveness, as they are not nearly as tanky and nearly as durable as a few other specs in the game right now. Those could be the two major issues when it comes to Hunters. Then, of course, there is also survival, but that is more of a problem about community perception, rather than the spec having problems itself. Survival by itself, it's a pretty decent spec, actually. It's just that the player base rightfully considers it a meme spec, and what was done to the spec in Legion to be a tragedy, which is understandable. Now, after them we have Mage. What is there to say about Mage? Well, it's sad, because we would have to be some home wreckers to fix Mage, because clearly Mage is in a relationship with Blizzard. So it's kind of hard to list all of the problems around Mage and their current state when Blizzard reworks a class which was already amongst the better classes in the game and gives them mass barrier, something that instantly makes them one of the higher value picks in high Mythic Plus keys because of its defensive power. And Mage was already known to be one of the tankier and more survivable of the specs, especially the ranged ones, right after Warlock. And on top of that, now they got something even stronger. The rework has made all three specs pretty good, at least gameplay wise and in terms of options, so you don't have too much to complain about that. The only problem around Mage at this point is how do they always find a way to be viable, strong, or meta in both the Raid and Mythic Plus with at least one of their specs, if not two at the same time. This is a luxury that is not given to the majority of the specs in the game, but it consistently seems to happen only to Mage. That would be the main issue around this class. Now, one of the more underrated, numbers-wise, classes of the game, Monk. So, Monk is pretty nice in terms of defensive power. They're also plenty good when it comes to utility. Even when it comes to playstyle, there aren't major concerns, like for example for Hunters when mentioning about being too simple, or perhaps Feral being a bit too convoluted. All three specs of Monk actually play pretty well. They have nice rotations, they are engaging, etc, etc. So we are again in a little bit of a community perception angle when it comes to Monk. It has gotten better in recent times with Mistweaver having a couple of good seasons, bringing more players to get to play the spec. There are some problems here and there, particularly around Brewmaster and Windwalker. Brewmaster's issues around their stagger scaling and how they can deal with massive heavy hits, not nearly as well as other specs. The more you scale in power, so the more you scale in Mythic Plus, the stagger starts to become a pretty big problem for the spec. as Blizzard continues to buff the value of Magic Stagger, which is another bigger problem for Monk. And for Windwalker, it's a bit more about identity. For years, players have memed on scaling when it comes to Windwalker and not being able to make use of their secondary stats nearly as well as other specs, as well as the traditional weakness of Windwalker, which was single target damage, compared to their much more competitive AoE damage as a spec ever since it was introduced. But overall, Monk is in a pretty good spot right now, even for all three specs. I don't think there is a major glaring blatant problem when it comes to the spec as a whole, besides being, as mentioned, a bit underplayed. Who is definitely not underplayed, because you can't go one key without seeing a red Paladin, is Paladin, of course. Even Prot Paladin, despite the popularity of Vengeance, is actually the most played tank in all keys, together with Vengeance, so even now it's a very popular tank. It's a very healthy class in terms of popularity. The rework has done very good for them, giving them way more useful things. Now they even have 2 usable and valuable auras they can use, giving them some nice 2 spots in a raid, for example. They still have the rest of their good utility. They are reasonably tanky. In the case of Red Paladin, they are amongst the tankier of the specs in the game. Not quite Mage level of problem of tankiness, but, you know, right at the edge of that level of being a bit too tanky. Ret is in a very good situation. Prot Paladin is mostly overshadowed by the power of Vengeance, but it's not doing badly either. The major issue, of course, you know, the major elephant in the room is Holy Paladin. The experiment of Blizzard of trying to mix the caster version of Paladin with the melee healer version of Paladin in a single talent tree has become, you know, not nearly as fully fleshed out and successful as perhaps Blizzard wanted. They do have a couple of interesting hero talents to choose from as a Holy Paladin, Herald of the Sun and Lightsmith, none of which is particularly fixing the issue of their holy power spenders being powerful even after this latest round of buffs, which buffed Light of Dawn and Word of Glory. Is still an issue for the spec. And that is mostly what you would like to see fixed in the next expansion. As mentioned, both specs have a pretty nice playstyle, perhaps a bit too simple for Red, but maybe it's just like BM. Players just like some, you know, simple, straightforward rotations. Very good on defensiveness, pretty good on utility. That is what seems like the major issue when it comes to Paladin as a class, coming in the next expansion, the state of Holy Paladin. Now on to Priest. Priest is doing quite well overall, Discipline, Holy and Shadow. You know, Shadow has been meta for a while. Holy Priest has been a very good healer in raids together with Discipline, depending on the tier, depending on the season in this expansion. So all 3 specs have enjoyed some level of popularity in this expansion. One of the major issues players lament, of course, when it comes to Priest, especially the healer version of Priest, is the lack of valuable and meaningful utility, like, for example, the lack of proper crowd control and the lack of a real interrupt as a spec, which is funny because Priest has also been the choice to be meta due to some of the utility they used to have, although it has since been nerfed. We are talking about Master Spell and Mind Soothe. Now they are not nearly as important, not nearly as valuable, so it is again more visible how these specs lack in terms of utility in a group. However, again, we have to go back to talk about Power Infusion, which is still a very useful tool for the spec. So it's a weird situation. It's hard to fix, especially since we already know these things are not getting addressed in the next expansion, since Power Infusion is still there. All 3 specs play quite well. You know, main players of each specs might have some quirks and some complaints about certain minor things around each spec, but in general, they are pretty nicely fleshed out specs to play, so there wouldn't be any major issues around the class as a whole. The only minor take is again on the healer side when it comes to the defensiveness, since both priest healers don't have nearly anything as strong as Dispersion, only Discipline having pain suppression, but that is an external you would like to keep for other players, so for yourself you are pretty squishy. You only have 1 major cooldown in Desperate Prayer, which is also not that great. That might be one of the main concerns of Priest going in the next expansion, which is still not massive. After that, we have Rogue. Rogue is interesting because despite what many of you might think, Rogue is actually very underplayed. It's, in general, the least played class in the game, if we don't count the newly released Evoker, but even now they are being played more than Rogue. So they are in this sort of difficult to gauge situation, because when it comes to utility, they do have the stance, the crowd controls, the lockdown of mobs in Mythic Plus a plenty. They have Shroud, which can still be quite useful. They even gave them a raid buff in this expansion, thanks to Atrophic Poison, the 3% damage reduction to enemies, basically a second devotion aura to have in a raid. So they also have a raid spot guaranteed, unlike some other specs. But there is this general feeling around rogues that they lack some identity, some real clear direction for at least two of the specs, Assassination and Subtlety. Outlaw is doing overall better. Outlaw does have an identity, the identity of a schizo carpal tunnel player who enjoys torturing his own hand, clicking 90 buttons per minute, that is locked down as a class fantasy, but for the other two specs it's a bit more muddy. That is what perhaps would be the problem around the class as a whole. It's not about their utility, not about their defensive power, which is very good, or the buffs or the debuffs they bring to the raid, or the playstyle of Outlaw Rogue that can be enjoyed by players who enjoy that style. It's more around the direction of both Subtlety and Assassination going in the next expansion. After them, alphabetically, we have Shaman. Well, Shaman has been amongst the more memed spec recently, especially getting into the War Within and the changes coming to the classes with the hero talents. The first issue, of course, remains the fact that Shaman is still without a raid buff, so they don't have a mandatory raid spot like pretty much any other class in the game besides Hunters. As mentioned before, Enhancement gets a pass, sometimes because of Windfury Totem, but Elemental and Resto are in pretty deep trouble. What makes it even more troublesome is their defensive power. Shaman is overall the squishiest class in the game. They have even fewer options than Evoker and even fewer options than Hunter to stay alive. Their main defensive is quite decent by itself. Astral Shift, 40% DR on a 90-second cooldown. Talented is pretty good, but then you want something else. You want an extra defensive, maybe a couple of defensives. Having your Earth Elemental giving you 15% more max HP is not that good. Perhaps they might be suffering from Blizzard having to put too many points of power in Ankh. So in having your own combat res might be the cost of losing a defensive cooldown, which feels kind of bad for Shaman right now. Besides that, they have tons of other utility, even if they lack a raid buff. Restoration Shaman is quite strong and plays quite well. Again, some players might be a bit off in the amount of power given to Resto Shaman in their chain heal, sort of making it a bit too focused on chain heal and not the rest of their toolkit. The opposite is for Enhancement. Enhancement is very well enjoyed for having some very cool and entertaining playstyles. The main issue might be, similar to Holy Paladin, how split they are in trying to play the lightning version of the spec versus the fire version of the spec. The next expansion is very well versed in giving them even more power in the lightning version with Stormbringer, but not really anything special for the fire version. So that might be the one problem for Enhancement. And then the worst one of all is Elemental. Elemental has a similar problem of Enhancement. They play either the lightning version or the fire version, and similar to Enhancement, they are getting more power in their lightning version, but not nearly as many options for their fire side. That is perhaps the bigger of the issues when it comes to the specs in the next expansion. The lack of proper defensive, the lack of a raid buff, and perhaps the choice in the identity of what do you want to do with your buttons in the next expansion. Warlock has gone through some level of complaints in the War Within and the planned changes for their specs, especially demo. Now, after a few weeks and even more changes in the War Within Alpha, demonology has gotten better, the outlook on the spec has gotten better. We certainly cannot complain about their level of utility, from Gateway to Hellstones to even Soulstones. They are doing just fine. Obviously, we can't complain about their defensiveness. We can, in fact, go the opposite way and complain about too much defensiveness when it comes to Warlocks. It's a bit too much of a gap when you look at the options for staying alive for a Warlock compared to a Shaman, or compared to a Priest, or compared to a Hunter. That's perhaps where one of the problems could be for the class as a whole. When it comes to the way the specs play, Demonology, after the reworks, we can give them a pass. Where we have the issues are with Affliction and Destruction. Now, Destruction might be one of those I don't really get it, but I guess some players enjoy it type of situation, like Beast Mastery or Marksmanship Hunter or like Red Paladin, because Destro is traditionally a 2-button spec. You play Incinerate, you use Chaos Bolts, every now and again you're gonna be using Immolate and Conflagrate, and that's it. And then in AoE you switch out Chaos Bolt for Rain of Fire. That's it, that's your entire thing. Some players enjoy it. So, you know, even if it's simple, even if it is straightforward, at least it is complete. It makes sense, it functions as a spec. Where more complaints might be seen is with Affliction. We are now on, you know, round 6, round 7 of the complaints when it comes to the Malefic Rapture problem. Many Warlocks are not too happy with the way Affliction plays and with the way a dot-based spec has now moved to having most of their power in a basically non-dot button. This becomes a bigger problem when you want to make Affliction work in Mythic Plus, because if mobs die in 10 seconds, how can you make a dot-based spec work? This is the same issues we had with Feral, the same issues we had with Assassination, and Blizzard tried to give them the same solution. They gave Feral an AoE ability, they gave Assassination a cooldown, like Indiscriminate Carnage, to, again, drain the dots to do instant damage, and Affliction got the same treatment with Malefic Rapture. And many players are still not enjoying this option. Perhaps it would feel better if Malefic Rapture had the same feel, the same impact as when you click Mortal Strike, or Chaos Bolt, or Lava Burst. Meanwhile, Malefic Rapture looks, sounds, and feels awful to even click or spam altogether. That, I think, is the main issue around the spec, the feel around Affliction. For the rest, though, Warlock as a whole is in a pretty good spot, a pretty solid class overall to play. The last of the list is gonna be Warrior. Now, Warrior does have quite a few things that make them, you know, straightforwardly good, if that is even a word. They have a raid buff with Battle Shout, they have a raid cooldown with Rallying Cry, they also have a single target stun, and then they also have an AoE stun, and technically they can also have an AoE fear. If they go for the old Spear of Bastion, now renamed Champion Spear, they also have a root, a snare cooldown for crowd control, and they are also traditionally quite tanky and durable. So all of these things are good. The only few complaints you can have about Warrior is their inability to deal with the affixes, namely Afflicted and Incorporeal. That is what is giving Warriors a bit more of an issue compared to other specs in Mythic Plus. Now, for the specs themselves, they are in a pretty good spot in terms of flavor, in terms of style. Arms has a very similar Zug, simple-minded playstyle, you know, BM, Marksmanship, Ret, Destruction, Warlock do have similar simple playstyle with one major satisfying button you press in your rotation, you know, Mortal Strike. For Arms Warrior, even Execute at certain points in your rotation, so it does feel quite good and fleshed out as a spec. It does also have clear weaknesses, like their lack of solid AoE, consistent AoE, and even large target AoE is not the strength of Arms. Fury is in a similar situation, a bit more accelerated, plays faster, clicks a few more buttons, is closer to the level of frenetic action and constant loops of rotations like Outlaw Rogue is compared to Arms. They have a bit better consistent AoE damage compared to Arms Warrior, but overall both specs play quite well. They have their clear strength and clear weaknesses. Nothing really seems that problematic about those two specs. Now, Prot Warrior, on the other hand, has not had nearly the same amount of success in this expansion. Even in the previous one, in Shadowlands, they only had a few moments of brilliance. They have been overshadowed multiple times by other tanks. However, they are in one of the more problematic situations because they look fine, they play fine, they seem okay, but they never quite seem to get into that meta spot right now. The last time Prot Warrior was seriously meta was in the second season of BFA. Even the last season was still popular. After that, it's been like 5 years, and they only had a couple of months at the beginning of Dragonflight before being taken over by Blood DK. So it's hard to properly pinpoint the main issue of Prot Warrior because most of the things around their kit do look fine. They just haven't found the right moment recently to be the meta tank. But it's hard to find too many major glaring issues with the spec as a whole. So it will be interesting to see what especially the hero powers, Colossus and Montantane, will do to the spec in the War Within, to see if any of these will be enough to give them more luster, a bit more of a shiny look getting into the next expansion that makes them more appealing to the player base. But overall, these are all the things going on right now with all of the classes in Dragonflight at the very least, going into the next expansion. What are their perhaps major issues or things you might want to see fixed or adjusted or even just improved going in the War Within? So this was our recap for today as we get close to the release of the beta of the War Within, around basically the current state of the classes and specs going into the next expansion. And then we will see, of course, how many of these things get improved or maybe completely left alone and unchanged. But for today, we are now leaving each other. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, also be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, Okay, fine. It's starting to get hot. We had to wait June to get into this territory. I hope, though, it doesn't get too hot, at least until July. Best case scenario, mid-July.